Release the Mother 3! Damn it!
Release me.
And release.
Mother 3 is the white whale of unreleased video games. While plenty of titles have never made it overseas, the demand for this game has uniquely broken into pop culture, almost reaching Half-Life 3 levels of devotion. Time has done little to quell the fans, because at the heart of Mother 3 is something very special and timeless. The Mother series has been the victim of unfortunate timing since the beginning. When writer Shigesato Itoi pitched his idea for a narrative-heavy RPG, Miyamoto firmly rejected him, only for the decision to be reversed shortly after. The resulting game was well received in Japan, but the localization took too long to complete and was withheld to make way for the launch of the SNES. When Mother 2 also became a hit on that system, Nintendo followed through with a US release, but marketed the game with a very 90s fart-centric, gross-out, Nickelodeon slime barf-scented sticker campaign that didn't communicate the quality of the story or gameplay. Players had also experienced most of the generation's RPGs by that point and found the comparatively humble cartoon visuals crude and unimpressive. The game flopped hard in America and only gained a footing with a cult audience. Mother 3's development was a disappointment for fans in all regions, spanning 3 systems and 2 failed disc add-ons. It was initially intended for the aborted SNES CD drive before migrating to the soon-to-be aborted N64DD, with the features of that device factoring heavily into the game's design. When the DD flopped, Earthbound 64 had to be scaled back not only to fit on a normal cartridge, but also to rein in the unattainable scale it had reached. The staff was overwhelmed taking on even the reduced workload of the cartridge version, and with priorities shifting to the GameCube, it became unreasonable to devote resources to an N64 game that almost certainly wouldn't launch until after the new hardware. Nintendo was just as disappointed by the cancellation as its fans, and never really let Mother 3 go. After flirting with the idea for a while, Miyamoto and Itoi finally made one last push to finish it on the Game Boy Advance with developer Brownie Brown. This 2D version seems at least somewhat faithful to what Earthbound 64 apparently was going to be, with certain scenes and level layouts bearing unmistakable similarities. The obvious difference is that it retains the pixel style of the previous games, lending it far more color than the drab N64 visuals. The characters are animated with such personality and the comedic timing is so natural that one might assume the game was always meant to look like this. It's still not a system-defining graphics showcase, but there is a kind of beauty in its clean simplicity. Some music also seems to have been salvaged from Earthbound 64. And as is often the case, it does some of the heaviest lifting to make the story land. Because this is still an unreleased game, I want to spoil as little as possible, but Mother 3 has an incredibly dynamic mood that goes places you couldn't possibly predict when happily strolling through the first area. The soundtrack is always deadlocked on the exact right feeling for each scene and effortlessly shifts between extremes in an instant to keep up with the plot. Hip Tanaka and Keiichi Suzuki had composed for the first 2 games as a team, but in their absence, Shogo Sakai was chosen to handle the music alone. His score seamlessly continues the weird tone of the earlier games, but doesn't just imitate them. It has its own kind of emotional depth, and is so full of references to Western music that it feels like the game is vomiting a jumble of Americana onto the player. In the good way. They're all cleverly chosen and subtle enough that you may just barely notice them, like the Batman theme being adapted for the Bat Enemy.
Must resist urge to dance.
Unfortunately, that amazing music was rung through one of the worst systems for audio in gaming history. The Game Boy Advance had no dedicated sound processor and music had to compete for time on the CPU, leaving the sound harsh and full of background hiss. Mother 3 fares surprisingly well regardless, but fans have uncovered what could have been by reconstructing the tracks at full quality. The samples on Game Boy Advance cartridges are actually pretty decent, and when ripping them with the MIDI data, you get this. It's just a shame that this can't be heard in-game. MGBA does have an experimental feature to improve the audio quality, but it's far too broken to use yet. For the time being, you still have to experience the story in lo-fi mode. The world layout is different than most top-down RPGs. Games like Earthbound and A Link to the Past had large, squarish maps that were filled in as a single continuous area. Mother 3's map looks much more like an N64 game, with narrow pieces stuck together end to end. It's hardly proof, but it could be another sign that Earthbound 64's map was mostly retained after the switch to 2D. Exploration is a little more linear and the game has a variety of ways of keeping you on track. A line of ants may block you, or a map fanatic may give you an objective marker, or some other weird thing will point you in the right direction. It keeps the pace flowing, but there was at least one moment where it seemed like there was no direction at all, so I ended up climbing a mountain and losing most of my inventory to tough enemies before finding out that you're actually supposed to visit a train station in town. It's possible that I missed an NPC conversation somewhere, and I'm sure the comments will spank my little ass for being such a noob, but the game basically got derailed for 20 minutes because I hadn't walked far enough onto this platform to trigger the cutscene, which seems like a rare blip in an otherwise tightly designed game. The segmented world makes sense with the broken up style of the story. Rather than going on an adventure through a variety of different towns, Itoi wanted to invest more in a single set of characters and instead mainly focused on one village. The concept is similar to Majora's Mask, where a greater density of gameplay is packed into a smaller area. While this could have run the risk of making the game repetitive, different events happen in each chapter that give the village a different feel. The chapters also swap characters around Pulp Fiction style, which gives a different context to your time in each setting. The decision pays off, as seeing even the smallest NPCs follow your journey to the end gives a sense that something truly big is happening. Most of them are still relatively disposable, but no opportunity for a joke has been overlooked. Almost every interaction you have with anything in the game is funny, even the control tutorials. The continuing tradition of text entry can also lead to a lot of horrible, evil fun, but I may have gone too far in a few places. Look, the song was relevant when I started this video, and it got less funny as it went. Oh god, no.
What have I done?
I praised Lisa the Painful RPG for being able to juggle disparate tones, but Mother 3 has it soundly beaten, because Lisa never had genuinely happy moments. Mother 3 begins in an innocent place with such a positive vibe, but wastes no time traveling elsewhere, even into borderline horror territory. And it's remarkable how one of the silliest games I've ever played is also one of the most emotionally real. It was advertised with actress Ko Shibasaki breaking down in tears while recounting her experience playing, and it wasn't some ridiculous exaggeration. The story has that kind of power, and this is a game that has literal fart boxes in it. I always think of story as something secondary to gameplay, something I'm not really there for and that has to work to earn my interest. On those terms, Mother 3 is the most successful thing I've ever played. It's fascinating and moving right from the start and keeps getting better from there. It helps that it's also a great playing game. It improves on Earthbound by making actions more direct and losing the menu for checking and interacting. Instead of visiting a hospital, you can revive your team more conveniently by using the plentiful hot springs. Saving is done quickly using frogs rather than calling your dad. The latter was a reference to Itoi's own overworked father, but the repeating walls of text could be a bit much, and it wouldn't have made much sense to call dad with so many changing characters anyway. Storing items also no longer requires calling a courier and waiting. Just find the item guy and exchange with him directly. There are still a few things that could have been more fluid, like the requirement that characters possess the items you want to equip. It becomes a hassle to shuffle items back and forth, especially late in the game when you're too stocked up to make room. There are also certain repeating animations that eat up a lot of time, which made me grateful to be playing on an emulator with a fast-forward feature. Outside of those nitpicks, they've generally fixed everything that could make the previous games feel sluggish compared to other RPGs. The power to instantly beat weak enemies returns with more control. You can still fight enemies by engaging them normally or trample right over them using the new run ability, which doubles as an improved replacement for the bike. Other ideas from Earthbound return and still feel every bit as unique. The rolling health meter gives you a short window to frantically heal before reaching 0, which could be seen as softening the difficulty, but I would argue that it allowed the enemies to become even harder. Fighting after you or your teammates have already died becomes a regular occurrence in later bosses, to the point where I can't imagine the game working without it. It adds more intensity and blurs the line between turns. Traditional RPG stiffness is broken up even more by the music battle system, which lets you land successive hits if A is pressed exactly in time with an enemy's heartbeat. It's hard to understand at first, as each enemy has a different pulse that can only be heard under hypnosis, and certain enemies seem totally immune. It's possible to completely ignore it and get by, but the action feel it adds to battles makes it well worth spending some time in practice mode until you get a grasp on it. Even the small combos feel great to pull off. It's also worthwhile to practice since the game retains the high difficulty the series is known for and can be brutally tough. Grinding isn't quite as effective as usual because your party changes so often, and even basic enemies can wipe your team out in a few turns with no chance to refill before a boss. In fact, there are a few enemy gauntlets where a tough boss will deplete your party and you'll be turned right back around to push through the same series of enemies again with no chance to save. Moments like that feel a little underhanded and cheap, but the difficulty is mostly very manageable. There's rarely one silver bullet strategy that makes a fight easy, but shuffling items around or starting with different PSI buffs can make a huge difference. I died a lot in this game, but rarely in the same place twice, because the battles are that responsive to experimentation. The gameplay stays just as fresh as the story, lasting me 27 hours without growing dull. It's a great RPG, a great story, and a great thing in general, and it was very positively received in Japan just like the entries before it. And then, nothing happened. There are a lot of theories about why the game was never localized. Miyamoto referenced the failure of Earthbound as a reason Mother 1 and 2 didn't come to the Game Boy Advance, but in the same breath marveled that 30,000 American fans had signed a petition for Mother 3 to be finished. By the early 2000s, Nintendo seemed well aware that Earthbound had finally found its US audience, and eventually gave the game a high-profile re-release on the Wii U. It doesn't seem as if they had much doubt that the games could sell anymore. They explicitly mentioned Mother 3 in their E3 event.
Come on, Reggie, give us Mother 3!
Oh, how about this instead?
Which one assumes is the kind of ribbing they would only give their fans if they planned to actually release the game. They went on to release Mother 1's localization for the first time ever under the name Earthbound Beginnings in 2015. On top of that, Lucas and Mother 3 assets were added to Smash Bros. It seemed as if Mother 3 must have been right around the corner, and according to Game Informer's senior editor, it was before Nintendo remembered what was in the game and lost their nerve. Fans tend to agree that the Magypsies, described as neither man nor woman, are the biggest stumbling block to a localization. Characters struggle to identify their gender, at least in the fan translation, and they behave in a flamboyant way that some consider to be a reductive stereotype. At the same time, they're very positive characters that are selfless heroes in the story, and Itoi has said that his hope was to inspire kind feelings towards similar characters in real life. There's enough room for interpretation that I've seen them described as both transphobic and transpositive. Either way, the game would certainly generate discussions in today's climate, and they aren't discussions Nintendo likely wants to have. The game is also filled with references to alcohol and drugs that would be pretty hard to remove. One entire sequence of the game is literally a mushroom trip. An official localization would also likely have to alter a lot of the edgier jokes. It's possible to change all of these things, but then it wouldn't really be Mother 3, and the core audience that Nintendo needs to sell it to may reject it. If Nintendo released the fan translation untouched, they might have an even bigger audience upset with them for different reasons. There's no easy way out, and I don't want to vilify them for not releasing it. But I do want to offer this fan movement as proof that the people using emulators want to buy their games. If we were all cheap pirates who just wanted things for free, we'd be set already. It's not hard to play Mother 3. Within 30 seconds you could find the ROM and an emulator and have booted into the title screen. Playing Mother 3 is no problem at all. What fans want is for it to be legitimate, for the game to get its rightful place in Nintendo's library and for us to be able to give them our money. Instead, there are inklings that maybe they're happy enough letting the unofficial channels handle this. The fan translation was done by a professional in his spare time and is, by all accounts, very good. The fact that all of the humor made it through razor sharp is proof enough of that for me. The staff received a letter that was supposedly from someone within the industry, possibly Nintendo itself, asking them not to release their work because it was too good and would render an official localization obsolete. The sender was never identified, but it is known that Nintendo's higher-ups were fully aware of the fan patch. They've never spoken against it or tried to block it in any way. Maybe this is their way out. The fans can play it and they don't have to take any responsibility for the content. But if that is the case, and they are happy enough to let the ROM sites handle this one, then they've got to stop shutting them down. It's a story as old as time. I don't know what Nintendo has to do to make a localization work, but what I do know is that this is a game that deserves to be released. After everything that Mother 3 and its staff went through, it's a miracle that the finished product exists at all, let alone that it lived up to all the expectations fans had along the way. For the game that prevailed over so much to die in a localization department would be a pretty sad ending to the story, so I'm going to say something a little controversial. I'm not going to win any awards for saying this, but I think Nintendo should probably, maybe, release the game at some point.
Bye.